A while back, I was on Facebook and I was commenting on one of the many football pages that are out there these days. And I said something to the effect that the 70s remain for me the greatest football decade. And this gentleman popped up and agreed with me. And I thought, wow, I really love this person. Let's find out more about him. And it turns out that he's Mr. Joe Zagorski, author of a book titled The NFL in the 70s, Pro Football's Most Important Decade. Welcome, sir. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Jeff. Glad to be here.
And we were just talking about you're in Tennessee now, but you are a Pennsylvania native from Pottsville?
Pottstown. Yes.
Pottstown, sorry.
Yeah, no, everybody gets them confused, but they're actually about an hour and 20 minutes drive from each other.
Awesome, awesome. So you got bitten by the bug. I mean, Western Pennsylvania is, football.
Oh, yeah, and so is Eastern Pennsylvania, even though they don't always admit it. But I grew up on the eastern side, but the whole state of Pennsylvania is football. It's a lot of people tend to think that their state is where football began. Actually, New Jersey is where college football began in 1869. And then the first pro game was played in Western Pennsylvania in 1892. So, even though Canton, Ohio declares itself to be the birthplace of pro football, that's not really the case. They're the birthplace of the Hall of Fame and the old famous Canton Bulldogs and Massillon Tigers. But Western Pennsylvania saw the first pro game with the first paid pro athlete.
Nice, nice. As you can tell, folks, this man knows his football. He's a member of the Pro Football Researchers Association. Your Facebook profile says that you're a co-owner of the Packers as well.
Yeah, I bought a share of stock a few years ago. So I don't get any money from it, but no Packers owner does.
So there you go. There you go.
You get a certificate that you can hang on a wall.
So how were you bitten by the football bug? The 70s, of course, I mean, it's the height of Steeler mania, all those Myron Cope-isms, the terrible towelitis, the 70 merger of the AFL and the NFL. What was how did you grow into the sport?
I was in third grade in the year 1971, and all of my classmates, when you're a young boy, you want to fit in with the crowd. You want to, develop friends, and all of my friends were interested in pro football. Never got into it in first or second grade. I don't know. I guess we were too busy trying to figure out, a whole bunch of other things. But starting in third grade, it was like a watershed. It just happened. And I started watching it. And of course, it was a lot different than it is today. Today, you can watch pro football 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's television stations all over about the game. But back at that time, you had 6 months to watch pro football, and that was it. In the summertime, you didn't have it. So, you enjoyed it while it was on. Television stations, we didn't have cable back then. You had 3 VHF channels, 3 UHF channels. That was it. And some places didn't even have that. I found out later on in life. So generally Saturdays and Sundays, Saturdays college football, Sundays pro football. And I just got bit by the bug as a child in third grade, and it just proceeded to grow. It snowballed over time. It took me a long time till I realized I wanted to write a book about that first decade that I enjoyed so much, the 70s. But once I finally got down to thinking about it, very, very much, I finally put pen to paper and I got to it.
Nice, nice. Walk us through your process and kind of some of the contents of the book, if you would.
Well, I knew that there were other books written about the 70s in the NFL, but I didn't want to come up with the same type of a book. I tried to figure out what was not out there and then write that kind of a book. And what wasn't out there at the time was like a chronology of every year, a chapter for each year. And so that's what I decided to do. I knew it was going to take a long time to write. It actually took me 6 years to write that book. I had a full-time job at the time, and so I could only write in the evenings and on weekends. And but I kept with it, and once one chapter was done, I started with the next and the next, and before you knew it, I was halfway done and was thinking, this is pretty good. I enjoy it, and I'm halfway done with it. So I just kept going. And by that time, it was under contract from McFarland to be published. So I sped up quite a bit and got it done in time for the deadline. I had to pick out somebody that I wanted to write a forward for it. First person I thought of, the criteria that I thought of was somebody that was around for most of the decade, who had some playing experience if possible, or some kind of experience in the NFL, and who was articulate enough to write a forward. So the first person I thought of was Roger Staubach of the Dallas Cowboys, but his secretary told me that he was too busy to do it. So the next person that I asked was Fran Tarkenton, quarterback of the Vikings. His secretary told me that he was too busy to do it. So then I contacted Brent Musburger of CBS Sports, the NFL Today, and he didn't get back with me. And then the fourth person I asked was Rocky Bleier of the Steelers. And he said, sure. So, okay, great. A week after Rocky said, yeah, Brent Musburger called me back. And he said, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get your message. But I told him, I'm sorry, because I already told Rocky Bleier that he could. And Brent was understanding. He said, no, that's a good choice. He's a good man, I knew once I got the person to write the forward, I knew I wanted to get that person on the front cover. And so I found a good picture that would allow for the majority of the title. And, so it worked out really well, and worked with the Associated Press for some photos, and it worked out pretty good. It was a good first book, and it still sells pretty well. Even, let's see, it came out in 2016, and we're in 2022 right now. So that's 6 years. And that was the whole idea, was to write something different, but something that was more like a textbook that had about as many facts in it as possible.
I can't wait to get my hands on this book.
Well, it's like 440 pages. And the publisher saved a lot of money on pages, because they made the print size really small. So if it was like a regular sized print size, it would be like 700 pages.
Wow.
So it's very thick, it's very heavy, and it makes for a great doorstop or paperweight if you don't want to read it. So
no, I'm for us sports replayers, we APBA guys, boy. I mean, this is, I'm sure the details are so, these are the kinds of things that we pore over incessantly and obsessively to find out who played what and exactly this, just to really get the tone of the game. And Bleier, I mean, is just really, he really kind of symbolizes that yeoman player, veteran, wounded, came back, in that era where, it wasn't that, from youth to, through college. I mean, that hyper preparation of the athlete. I mean, they were prepared, certainly, but there was still that kind of semi-pro almost aspect to the era.
It was a different time back then. And, a lot of people don't realize today, but back then, unless you were a marquee name like a Joe Namath or an O.J. Simpson, you were not making a lot of money. A backup quarterback for the Steelers, Terry Hanratty, he and I are friends, and he is only making roughly, I think it was $25,000 a year as a backup quarterback who did split time with Terry Bradshaw for a few years. So he was a starting quarterback for some time. 25,000, it went further back then. The dollar went further, but that's still not a whole lot of money. And everybody, that wasn't a marquee name, at the end of their season, they went to their next job. They always had another job lined up. I wrote a book on Willie Lanier, who played middle linebacker for the Chiefs. And, he's in the Hall of Fame, but he had a summer job working for a beer distributor. So to make ends meet in the 70s, you had to be a regular guy. There wasn't that many prima donnas at that time.
No. I mean, you really had to. It was a love of the game for
Mhm.
sure, but it wasn't so hyper monetized, perhaps. Certainly with those paychecks, and those guys did play. Even then, that money in the playoffs and for the Super Bowl certainly meant a lot more,
It
probably.
it did. It certainly did. And that's, the Steelers were very fortunate because they went to the playoffs every year from 72 through the end of the decade, all the years. And the longer you played in the playoffs, the more money you got. So back at that time now, I mean, today's football players would laugh at what those guys are being paid. But back at that time, they were getting paid more than their predecessors were getting paid. So it's a cycle.
Sure.
Who knows, 10, 20 years from now, who knows what they'll be making.
Oh, goodness. Going back to 1971, a really
Mhm.
pivotal year, Super Bowl V. The
Right.
Cowboys lose it. It's the only time the player on the losing team wins the MVP, Chuck Howley,
Hmm.
and then O'Brien kicks the winning field goal for the Colts. 71, the quarterback carousel in Dallas, but they end up winning Super Bowl VI
Right.
against the Dolphins, who then go undefeated in 72, repeat in 73. In 74, the Steelers finally make it over the hump. 72, after that, immaculate reception, it couldn't quite get past the perfect Dolphins in Pittsburgh, no less, thanks to the weird scheduling of the 70s. 75, the Hail Mary game. 77 goes to the post, and the Cowboys finally repeat in the first indoor Super Bowl, Super Bowl 12, when again defenders win the MVP, and it's Randy White and Harvey Martin, the only dual MVP winners. Then in 78, you've got the first 16 game season, the first 2-team wild card playoff. You got the Mel Blount rule, and Bradshaw, Swan, and Stallworth light up the league in what is one of the great Super Bowls ever, and they
Hmm.
repeat again for the 79 season. So it's
Right.
just chock full of memorable moments. What are some of the other highlights of the decade for you?
Oh, wow. There's a lot. I would say O.J. Simpson's 2003 yards rushing in 73, the first and only player to ever rush for over 2,000 yards in a 14 game season. That'll never be equaled because there'll never be another 14 game season. They're up to 17 games now, and who knows when that's going to go up to 18 games. So a lot of records are going to fall by the wayside when they keep adding these extra games. Um, there's a lot of great things that have happened in the game, that a lot of upsets that a lot of people could never predict. The biggest playoff upset that I ever saw in that decade happened in '79 when the Houston Oilers went into San Diego. San Diego at that time they were kind of like they they were kind of like the best show on turf on actual grass. They would throw the ball all the time. Dan Fouts, he had great receivers, Charlie Joyner, oh gosh, John Jefferson, all those guys. And but the Houston Oilers were banged up. Pastorini was sitting out that game. Earl Campbell couldn't play. They were just banged up. But they came in there to San Diego and they upset the heavily favored Chargers. I think it was 17-14, and they intercepted Dan Fouts, I believe, 5 times. Vernon Perry had 4 interceptions in that game, a rookie defensive back. So, I mean, games like that I explore in pretty good detail. I spend more time talking about the playoffs in that book because that's generally what a lot of people remember. But I also go into the regular season games. Um, I try to address a lot of stuff that you wouldn't regularly find. For example, in '78, you had the miracle in the Meadowlands where Joe Pisarcik fumbles the ball. Well, and Herman Edwards of the Eagles picks it up, runs in for a touchdown, and the Eagles make the playoffs that year. At the end of that year, the last regular season game, the Giants, a season ticket holder, decides to put out notice that he's going to be burning their season tickets in a bedpan outside the stadium prior to the game, and people donated their tickets as a form of protest. I included that in the book. Another thing that happened off the field that was pretty intriguing was the strike, the NFL player strike in '74. It was not the first strike in players' history, and it certainly wasn't the last, but it was important because it gave people an idea that these guys are just regular guys. They're holding picket signs just like, my father, the steel worker, did, and stuff like that, and it got to the point where you started to see people learning about what a scab was, and it wasn't something on your skin. It was a person that crossed the picket line who, lacking a solidarity. There were a lot of stories that came from that strike. I've written a couple of articles about it that have yet to be published, but I'm waiting for them to get published by the Pro Football Researchers Association. And I interviewed several different players for that. Let's see, Terry Hanratty was one. Mercury Morris of the Dolphins was another. Phil Villapiano of the Raiders was another. So we went into detail, and a guy who I wrote a book on, Bill Bradley, former safety of the Eagles, he wouldn't give me this player's name, but he said there was a teammate of theirs that crossed the picket line, and they found a way to get even with him. He was a quarterback, and on one particular play, the offensive line wasn't able to block well enough, and he got creamed. and that was, I won't give you away the name because I could guess by who it was, but he never told me, so I'm not going to tell you. But but there was a lot of stories about that '74 strike, and that's in the book as well. I tried to include a lot of different interesting things. The Colts season of '75, really incredible season that they had, and of course the Steelers of '76. Even though they didn't go to the Super Bowl, they were considered by many people to have the greatest Steelers defense of all time. 5 shutouts in 14 games. That's really great. I mean, I don't think that record can ever be broken. And of course, neither can Pittsburgh's. Let's see. I think they've got 5 or 6 different Hall of Famers from the draft class of '74. I think because you've got Donnie Shell made 5.
Was the walk-on, right?
I mean, that'll never get equal.
No.
Especially when you consider the draft today is only about 7 rounds long. That'll never get equaled.
Now, if Blyer and Harris aren't injured in that '76 AFC Championship game, do the Steelers win, and do they beat the Vikings in the Super Bowl?
Depends on who you ask. If you ask the Steelers, they'll say yes. And I asked Phil Villapiano about that. He said no. So it all depends on who you ask. And but Terry Hanratty did tell me a funny story. The rivalry between Oakland and Pittsburgh was the fiercest rivalry in NFL history, bar none. There's none more fiercer than that. Yeah. And Terry Hanratty told me a story that in the 1990s, they had a touch football game organized in Oakland for members of the old Steelers of the '70s to play some of the Raiders of the '70s in this touch football game. And it was the same night as there was a World Series game going on in San Francisco, right across the bay. They had over 20,000 fans show up for that touch football game. And Terry Hanratty told me that when the Steelers players came out, they booed the crap out of him. He didn't say the word crap out of us again. And he goes, yeah, it was just like you could go home again. It was like seeing the old memories again from the '70s where they were given, the bird to the Steeler players and things like that. So the rivalry never died out. The Steelers fans and Raiders fans, they remember that decade a lot. And I feel sorry for people that weren't around during that decade, because they really, those of us who are old enough to remember it, really got a good look at the way pro football was at that time and how exciting it was.
Thankfully, a lot of those games are available now on YouTube, ads and all. And so you can really kind of go back. And my wife always says, why would you go back and watch a game where you already know the score? And I would contend, well, why would you go to an opera you've already seen? Or why do you listen to Sergeant Pepper's over and over? Because it's incredible. It's an incredible performances. Walter Payton, come on, 275 yards against the Vikings in 77, right? Talking about the Chargers, Eric Coryell, before he was in San Diego, he was with the then St. Louis Cardinals, who were, with Jim Hart kind of coming along, but couldn't quite get up to the top of the AFC East. Of course, harking to the 80s, Bill Walsh in Cincinnati, feeling the full wrath of the Steeler onslaught for a good part of that decade. So a lot of precursors to the future of football.
Definitely, and the big names that played in the 70s are still household names today. I mean, you're still seeing Joe Namath on television commercials. Terry Bradshaw is just as popular now as he was back then. So there's, the names of the 70s still hold pretty much weight even today.
Do you, when you look at today's game, there's a book by Ron Jaworski, co-written with Greg Cosell and another author, I believe, but Games That Changed the Game, 7 games that really moved the ball forward, if you will. And the second game that they study in depth is the 74 AFC Championship, Steelers at Oakland. And they talk a lot about Bud Carson and the cover 2, dropping Lambert in the coverage. Do you see these shades of the game from that originated in the 70s, in today's game? Even all the motion and deception of the Cowboys and the shotguns. Clearly, I mean, that was like from outer space.
Yeah, it's possible, and some of the things, you can see how it was like a foreshadowing later on, but some of the stuff, you kind of wish that it wasn't. Back in the 70s, the coaching was, you had 2 kinds of coaches. You had a vast majority coaches who wanted to imitate Lombardi, real hard-nosed, scream in your face type. And then there were a few coaches that were players coaches, that wanted to get along well with the players, like a Sam Rutigliano in Cleveland, stuff like that. Today, nowadays, you've got the players that are more or less running the teams. In the 70s, you would have, a coach would gather the team around the sideline right before the game, give them a quick, instructions. It's the players that are doing that now, that are, and the showboating of the 70s was nothing compared to today. Today, those players know where those cameras are located, and they want to go on television, and I kind of understand, because there's no promises in pro football. There's no guarantee they're going to, not get injured the next play and never be heard from again.
Yeah.
So I can understand that to a degree, but I can also understand that if a player from the day did that against the Steel Curtain defense, he would get a chance to visit the hospital. So the game has changed, and it has led to other things. But, I think that if you talk to the average person who played in the 70s, they would probably be able to say that they could play very well in this day and age.
Oh, totally.
But if you look at the average weights and heights of the players today are bigger, stronger, and faster. It's just, and that's just from, I guess, weight training and nutrition and working out. And the players today, it's a full-time job of football. They don't need a second job. They're working out all the time playing football because the salaries are so much higher. They don't need a second job. Yeah. So I would think that today's athlete can far outdistance players of the 70s, and the players of the 70s can certainly do better than the players of the 30s and 40s.
Sure,
So,
sure, sure. And yet today you've got guys like you had guys like Edelman or Welker. I mean, they were kind of smaller. They were, maybe not exactly the body type of, say, a Cliff Branch or a Charlie Joyner, but I'm looking at the card of Mr. Larry Little here. He was a
yeah,
Hall of Famer. You're actually working on a book with him. You spoke with him, I think, a couple days ago.
yeah.
6'1", 265 for his 78 card here.
He,
So
he he told me that his first meeting with Don Shula was a unique experience. He introduced himself. Don Shula had just been named the new Dolphins head coach, and he goes, "Hi, I'm Larry Little. I'm one of your offensive guards." And the first words out of Don Shula was, "How much do you weigh?" And Larry said, 285. And Shula just turned around and walked away from him, didn't say a word. So he definitely wanted him to lose some weight, and he did. And they had a good future together. So much so that when Larry went into coaching himself at his alma mater, Bethune-Cookman, Coach Shula gave Larry a Dolphins playbook to use. So, that didn't happen too often. So, they were really good friends until Coach's passing. But yeah, he's got some incredible stories to tell. He says that Joe Green was one of the toughest defensive tackles he ever had to block, and he said that the strongest defensive tackle he ever had to block was Curly Culp with the Chiefs, and who later played for the Oilers. And he said that the quickest was Mike Reed, who used to play for Penn State and the Bengals.
Yeah.
But he said that the best all-around tackle he ever had to block was Joe Green.
Wow. I'm of the opinion that Super Bowl 13 has to remain in the top 10 of Super Bowls in perpetuity, even though we've had some superb games in the past 10, 20 years. So many Hall of Famers on that team. The first Super Bowl rematch, Cowboys defending champions, a lot of trash talk. What do you think about that game?
Oh, it's a great game for sure. I think it's certainly up there in the top 5, but my favorite is Super Bowl 10. I thought that came out of nowhere. I thought you had the defending champion Steelers against a Cinderella team, the Cowboys, who a lot of people didn't think belonged there. And turns out the Cowboys had the lead into the fourth quarter. It was just it went down to the final 3 seconds before a winner was decided. You had boring Super Bowls beforehand, 7, 8, 9, well, 6. And, there were several boring Super Bowls that were really just not high scoring. They weren't exciting. And then Super Bowl 10 came out of the blue, and it was exciting. And it had everything. It had good defensive football. It had Jack Lambert being Jack Lambert. It had Lynn Swann being Lynn Swann. One of the greatest touchdown bombs in Super Bowl history, Bradshaw to Swann. I go with Super Bowl 10 as being my favorite, but Super Bowl 13 had a lot more scoring, and but that was the way of the league at that time with the Mel Blount rule, and the offensive linemen could extend their arms in 78 to basically, they called it legalized holding. Defensive players didn't like it. But it led to more scoring, and more people wanted more scoring. And we haven't seen the defense getting any breaks since.
Two of the most controversial calls, the defensive interference against Lynn Swann in Super Bowl 13, and then that AFC Championship call that nullified the Mike Renfro touchdown of the Oilers. Kind of another kind of driver of instant replay calls.
There was a lot of fans might not realize this, but there was no instant replay being used throughout the 1970s. But boy, they sure called for it. There were a lot of people ever since really the Immaculate Reception on throughout the decade. Anytime there was a controversial play, somebody would be complaining that we need instant replay, whether it be team owners like Al Davis of the Raiders, or players themselves, they would be arguing for instant replay. The first instance that you were talking about in Super Bowl 13, where Lynn Swann tripped up over Benny Barnes's legs on a deep pass by Terry Bradshaw. Today, I think that would have been called incidental contact. But the referee at that time threw the flag, and that gave the Steelers, I believe, 33 yards of real estate that really saved them and got them going, because they had a really bad third quarter.
Yeah.
And that was early in the fourth quarter where they were able to put together some scoring drives. And the Cowboys complained about that, but I remember Chuck Noll saying, he said that the Steelers Super Bowl ring from that year has a little button on it, and you push the button and you can hear Tom Landry bitching about that Super Bowl. And then, of course, that other one in the AFC title game, the 79 title game, Oakland and Houston and Pittsburgh, the Mike Renfro catch, I've looked at it so many times. I really think that if we had instant replay in the 70s, they would have overturned that and given a hands-up touchdown for that. I just think because the way we have it now with instant replay, it's frame by frame. And certainly at the time, the referees, of course, did not have the use of instant replay at that time, but Merlin Olsen and Kurt Gowdy, I believe it was, or it could have been Dick Enberg, they were up in the booth, and they both said, this is a touchdown. And, of course, they had the ability to see that on instant replay. It just looked like he had possession and his feet were in bounds. And when NFL Films came out the few days later with their camera was right there in the end zone, if you slowed that down to a frame by frame, you'd have to declare that's a touchdown. Now, there's the argument. Would that have helped the Oilers to win the game? I don't believe so. I think it would have made it closer, but I think the Steelers would have just, shifted into another higher gear, and I think they would have prevailed. I think it would have been a great ending. I think it would have been closer, but I just think that the Steelers were they were a dominating team. Now, 79 Steelers, they committed so many turnovers, and, they probably thought, well, they shouldn't even belong in the Super Bowl. But they beat Miami in the playoffs, who had a good year. They beat, of course, Houston. And the Rams played the best game of their year in Super Bowl 14, and they still beat them. So, it's hard to, I asked Larry Little about the 72 Dolphins, and the biggest complaint about the 72 Dolphins is that they had an easy schedule, a weak schedule. And Larry told me that's an insult to him.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to insult Larry Little, but, they had to beat Cleveland, they had to beat Pittsburgh, and they had to beat the Redskins to win the title. And they did that, and those teams didn't get to the playoffs by accident.
Right.
So, they even though they may have played weaker competition in the regular season, they still won every game.
Right.
There's something to be said for that.
Well, and they put the exclamation point on it by repeating in 73, and had the World Football League not come along and shuffled some lineups, who knows if that they could have. It's hard to three-peat, boy. No one has done that. So it's
some have come close, and
close.
I think we'll eventually see that in the NFL. I also think we'll eventually see another undefeated team.
Yeah, I'll go all the way for sure.
I mean, the Patriots almost did it one year. They came in a Super Bowl doing it. So
Sorry, for sure. You know,
Mhm.
speaking of that, you know, again, going back to the Steelers, that 1980 season, turning the clock on the decade, and that one for the thumb, but they just couldn't quite get it done. It really signaled a sea change, you know, for a decade that saw, you know, unforgivably Jack Lambert forced into a 3-4 defense, for instance, and you know, the untouchable Lawrence Taylor redefining you know, the linebacker position. I mean, it
Yeah.
just it really was that hallmark. And you talk about the competition, and you know, that 80 season where the Falcons and the Eagles finally were chipping away at those 70s, you know, the Cowboys, and you know, Staubach out of the picture and a shakeup in
Mhm.
Oakland. I mean, it really was a definitive change in that 1980 season from all that came before.
Right. Without a doubt, Bill Walsh had something to do with it, with the San Francisco offense a year later. And um, there, you could see a tectonic shift going on in the NFL landscape. Uh, and it just opened my eyes to the reality the 70s is gone.
Yeah.
The decade that I grew up loving is gone now. So, you know, what do you do? You can't repeat the past. You can't bring it back, um, except maybe in a touch football game.
Oh,
But
yeah.
yeah,
In
that's
Apple
that's
football. My 78 original Apple football set here.
uh,
Speaking of 78, another great call. I forget if it was the 78 season, but you can't forget the Holy Roller. Raiders Chargers, was it?
yep, yeah, yeah. That was
Just
one
win,
of the
baby.
few times that the Raiders actually got over on because
Yeah.
they were on the losing end of a lot of questionable calls over the decade. The one most egregious one that comes to my mind is the Rob Lytle fumble in the
Oh,
'77 AFC
oh
Championship
yeah.
game. I mean, that was a fumble.
Yeah.
I mean, and but the referees blew their whistle and they said they didn't see it. So, and that led to a 20-17 Denver win. That wouldn't have happened if they would have ruled that a fumble. So, but the Holy Roller was a unique play that they changed the rules that very next off season. You can't have like one player pick up a ball and fling it underhanded down the field, and another player kick at it and dribble it and then fall on it into the end zone. No. So they eliminated that from happening again. But that was, you know, a lot of people think that, oh, that was a playoff game, was it? No, that was the second week of the season. That happened early in '78. And as it turned out, it didn't help the Raiders anyway, because I don't think they made the playoffs that
No,
year.
no, no, just missed out. No. Yeah, and
So
that's you know, and you could tell I can see that game because those West Coast games are obviously they're always sunny, but you know, you got to go back to those old stadiums of the 70s, particularly when, you know, it would still be, you know, October, September, October, and you'd still see the baseball diamond on the
yeah,
field, and these guys are truly running in a cloud of dust. That is, if they weren't playing at something like Three Rivers with the AstroTurf, it's basically playing on concrete or on a parking lot or something.
I I
Are
had
any of
I
those
I've yet to meet a player back at that time who liked AstroTurf. I have yet to meet one or talk to one.
for sure,
They
for
all
sure.
hated it.
Have you been to any of those stadiums before they were torn down?
I grew up at Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia, basically, and that was that and Memorial Stadium, Baltimore, were really the two ones that I went to. Now, of course, the Colts aren't even the Colts anymore; they're the Indianapolis Colts, and that stadium's been torn down, as is Veterans Stadium. It's a parking lot now. Even Giants Stadium is no longer there. It's, you know, been torn
Yeah,
down.
yeah.
So most of the stadiums from the '70s, the Louisiana Superdome is still up in New Orleans. That came around the mid '70s. Uh, Most of the other ones are torn down. Even the Orange Bowl got torn down, and man, I can't think of any that are still standing that haven't been torn down. Even the Kingdome in Seattle and old Tampa Bay Stadium, they're both been torn down. So, um, you know, and it's all about money. You know, you're not going to get as big revenues when you have a stadium that seated under 50,000. If you're not seating at least 60,000, you're behind the times, and so it's just about money. And that's part of the reason why the players are making more these days. And part of the reason why ticket prices keep going up.
Well, sure, for sure.
And,
I'm so glad you brought up Seattle and Tampa. Of course, the
mhm.
the dreaded '76 season. Great uniforms, great franchises, but wow.
Yeah, a lot of people think, Tampa Bay 0-26 to start their franchise, but they won 2 games in '77 at the end of the year, and everybody thinks, well, they must have improved somewhat. Nuh-uh, look at the stats. '76 team was better statistically than the '77 Buccaneers. So there's some little bit of gray areas with the NFL, but Seattle was a step above them until '79,
Yeah.
when Tampa Bay made it all the way to the NFC Championship game. Now
Wow.
that was unforeseen. They got really lucky. They benefited from an easier schedule
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
But they did play pretty well, and when you start the season off 5-0, your chances of making the playoffs are good,
Oh, yeah.
I would think.
Well,
You
and
know,
they hosted the Rams at the NFC Championship game. Lost only 9-0. There's 3 Frank Corral field goals for the Rams, and actually, I got to see the Steelers play the Bucks in Tampa in 1980. I got at that old stadium, and Bucks only lost by 3 points. Donnie Shell saved the game with a late interception in the fourth quarter. So, I mean, they the Selman brothers. I mean, Ricky Bell, Jimmy Giles. They had something going on.
oh yeah, yeah, but it took a while for them to get there, and I always liked John McKay, the head coach. I thought he was funny as hell. He's a great guy. There were certain trends that you would see in the '70s, like you mentioned, the Steelers, the steel mill type of a team. Um, you know, Eventually you even got to the point where the Jets became like a glamour team with Mark Gastineau, and um, but I would think that there are some teams that were still searching for an identity. Take the Packers, for example. In the '60s, Lombardi was their identity. Well, they didn't really have an identity in the '70s. They had a difficult time, and they couldn't remain winners. They had one winning season in that whole decade, '72, and the rest of the years they couldn't win. They came close in '78 to having a winning year, but they didn't do it. And so they were looking for an identity. I would think that the Steelers, the steel mill, had the biggest identity of them. When you mention the Steelers, you're talking about people that worked in a steel mill and a team that played like they were in a steel mill. There wasn't much finesse. They tried to finesse it with Swan and Stallworth in the passing game, but before '78, it was run the ball down your throat. And the passing game was helpful just to enable them to keep running. And of course, the defense was the defense. So,
For sure. And there's also the era where, as I recall, the Steeler fans were the Italian fan base. Franco's Italian army were hollowing out loaves of Italian bread and sneaking wine into the stadium. So
oh yeah.
just a different time.
Well, I went to a Steelers game many years after the '70s, not at Three Rivers, but at the new stadium, and I was sitting next to some folks who offered me more than just a typical beer. you
There we
know,
go.
so they're every that happens in every stadium.
Oh, yes, that's true. That's true. Hey, Joe, it's been such a real pleasure here, and I just want to, before we wrap up and get into when their little book is coming out, or you expect to come out, and talk just quickly about your podcasting, but just who are some of the unsung players? Who are some of the people who kind of really put that PFRA Hall of Very Good spin on some of these folks who need to be known?
I think one person who is probably not in the Hall of Very Good but should be is Tony Galbraith, who played
Mm,
opposite of Chuck Muncie for the New Orleans, and then he also played for the Vikings. One of the best pass catching running backs of the game, and not much is known about him. And I'd like to see him get more attention. But he was an unsung runner, and on that same wavelength, Wilbur Jackson, who played for the 49ers, he was kind of like uh, the forerunner to Roger Craig.
yeah.
He could do it all. But he was a bit stockier and more of a fullback type. And then there's a guy like a journeyman like Jim Plunkett, who had a terrible first two teams, the Patriots and the 49ers, and he didn't do really much of anything. But he's able to get on the Raiders and he wins two Super Bowls.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that's a lot of people say that Plunkett should be in the Hall of Fame. I don't think he ever will, just based on his previous time that he spent with the Patriots and the 49ers and how they weren't able to win. There's unsung. It's a very good question. There's a lot of different players that probably deserve. I've got one for you. A friend of mine, Ken Burrow, played for the Atlanta Falcons. He still holds the Atlanta Falcon record for yards per catch, with over 20 yards per catch, I believe, average. And he played in the 70s. And so we're talking 50 years, and he still holds a record. And in today's pass happy NFL, that's quite phenomenal. He wore number 82, and then Ken Burrow for the Oilers was 00. And Ken Burrow for the Falcons, a friend of mine, told me that he would get by mistake, he would get Ken Burrow 00's pension checks because they thought they were the same guy.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Tony Goldberg, who ended up winning his Super Bowl ring with the '86 Giants. Guys like Fred Dean and Hacksaw Reynolds and Russ Francis, talk about Plunkett and those Patriots. I mean, they ended up getting their rings in the next decade. So there was some justice there for some folks. Yeah.
Yeah.
After living through one of the most brutal football decades.
If anybody wants to know where they can find my books, at Amazon.com is the best place to get them.
Awesome. And you mentioned that you're doing a podcast about once a month.
Yeah, it's called The NFL in the 1970s. I also have a Facebook page called The NFL in the 1970s.
I tell you, when APBA or any of the game companies are talking about re-releasing sets, it's always 77, 78, 79, 76, one of those sets. I mean, there's certainly interest in the 50s and 60s and clearly all the formative moments there, but there's just that something about the 70s coalesced. And maybe it's just because it's a combination of us remembering it and also being able to partake in the digital side of all your, Facebook and podcasts and kind of really bring it back to life. So thank you for all your work.
Oh, no problem. I'm glad to do it. I enjoy it.
Awesome. Well, thank you, sir. It's been a real pleasure. Hope to speak to you again sometime. It's been
okay. Yeah. When I have two books that are waiting to be published, and one's on the 73 Buffalo Bills, and one's on former Eagles safety Bill Bradley. And once they both get published, I'll make announcements and I'll go on different podcasts about them.
Thank you, sir. It's been
no problem.
Real thrill.
Glad to be on, Jeff. You take care of yourself.
You as well.